Number 1. Jose Vigoa. Long before his name became synonymous with fear in Las Vegas, Jose Manuel Vigoa was already living a life surrounded by mystery. Born in Cuba in the early 1960s, Vigoa grew up during one of the most turbulent periods in the nation's history. According to accounts that later emerged during investigations into his crimes, he was believed to have received military-style training and spent years developing the discipline and tactical skills that would eventually make him one of the most dangerous criminals Nevada had ever encountered. When Vigoa arrived in the United States, he appeared to be just another immigrant trying to build a new life. But beneath the surface was a man who seemed drawn to risk, power, and violence. By the 1990s, he had already accumulated criminal convictions, including drug-related offenses. Most criminals might have seen prison as a warning. For Vigoa, it appeared to be preparation. In September 1998, Las Vegas became the hunting ground for a criminal operation unlike anything local authorities had seen before. Vigoa allegedly assembled a crew that targeted casinos and armored vehicles with military precision. Their targets included some of the most famous casinos on the Las Vegas Strip, including the MGM Grand, Mandalay Bay, New York, Desert Inn, and eventually the Bellagio. Armed with powerful weapons, body armor, and carefully planned escape routes, the gang struck repeatedly while law enforcement struggled to identify the masterminds behind the attacks. What made the crimes particularly terrifying was the willingness to use deadly force. On March 3, 2000, an armored truck arrived outside a Ross Dress for Less store in Henderson, Nevada. Security guards Richard Sosa, a 47-year-old father of 5, and Gary Dean Prestige II, only 23 years old, were carrying out what should have been a routine cash transfer. Instead, they walked into an ambush. Gunfire erupted in the parking lot. When the shooting stopped, both men lay dead. The murders shocked Nevada and transformed a robbery investigation into one of the state's most intense manhunts. Investigators suspected that the same crew responsible for the casino robberies had carried out the armored car attack. Yet proving it would take months of painstaking work. Surveillance footage, witness interviews, forensic evidence, and intelligence gathered by local police and the FBI gradually pointed toward one man, Jose Vigoa. Even then, Vigoa behaved as though he were untouchable. Authorities later described him as arrogant and fearless. According to investigators, despite appearing on surveillance cameras during several robberies, he continued operating throughout Las Vegas as though the police could never catch him. One veteran detective reportedly called him among the most arrogant suspects he had ever encountered in more than 2 decades of law enforcement. The empire began to collapse after the infamous Bellagio robbery. During the heist, armed men stormed the casino's cash cage and escaped with approximately $160,000 in cash and chips. Security cameras captured critical evidence, giving detectives the break they desperately needed. When officers moved in to arrest Vigoa, he did not surrender quietly. He led police on a high-speed chase through Las Vegas traffic before crashing and attempting to flee on foot. The pursuit ended with officers taking him into custody. During subsequent searches, authorities recovered weapons, body armor, cash, and other evidence connecting the crew to multiple robberies. As prosecutors built their case, the full scale of Vigoa's operation became clear. Officials described him as the mastermind behind a criminal spree that had terrorized Las Vegas for nearly 2 years. One prosecutor later called him one of the most dangerous criminals in the history of Clark County. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a death sentence, Vigoa ultimately pleaded guilty. The plea ensured he would avoid execution, but it guaranteed something else. He would never again experience freedom. He received 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole for his role in the robberies and murders. His accomplices fared no better. Oscar Sanchez Cisneros, one of the key members of the crew, confessed to several crimes before dying by suicide while in jail awaiting trial. The criminal empire that had once seemed unstoppable collapsed completely. Today, Jose Vigoa remains one of the most infamous inmates ever associated with Ely State Prison. Decades after his conviction, his name still echoes through true crime documentaries and law enforcement circles as a reminder of one of the most audacious criminal campaigns in Las Vegas history. He entered Nevada as a robber seeking fortune. He left his mark as a convicted killer destined to spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls and steel bars. Number 2, Thomas Randolph. Few inmates housed within Nevada's prison system have carried a reputation as chilling as Thomas Randolph. While many killers are remembered for a single horrific crime, Randolph became infamous because death seemed to follow him from one marriage to the next. Over the years, investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts would give him a nickname that sounded like something pulled from a horror novel, the Black Widower. But unlike the Spider, Randolph was not accused of trapping strangers. The people who allegedly suffered most from his schemes were the women who loved him. Born in the late 1950s in the United States, Randolph appeared ordinary on the surface. Friends described him as charming, witty, and capable of winning people over within minutes. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention. Yet beneath that charm, former spouses and investigators would later describe a much darker personality, one that seemed obsessed with control, money, and manipulation. His first marriage ended in divorce. Then came another relationship, and another. Eventually, Randolph would be married 6 times. That fact alone was not unusual. What made authorities take notice was something far more disturbing. 4 of those wives died, while insurance policies often appeared in the background of the investigations. One of the earliest deaths involved his second wife, Becky Galt. In 1986, she died from a gunshot wound to the head. Randolph maintained that she had taken her own life. Authorities initially ruled the death a suicide, and he later received a substantial insurance payout. Years afterward, investigators revisited the case and charged him with murder, believing the circumstances were suspicious. However, Randolph was ultimately acquitted of the murder charge, allowing him to walk free. Even so, the case never completely disappeared from public discussion. As the years passed, more tragedy followed. Another wife reportedly died after heart surgery. Yet another former spouse later testified in court that she believed Randolph had once attempted to kill her after a firearm discharged inside their home. Witnesses also claimed that he had explored murder-for-hire plots involving one of his wives years before the crime that would eventually send him to prison. Each allegation added another layer to the mystery surrounding him. Despite these controversies, Randolph remained free. Then came Sharon Corse. By 2008, Sharon had become Randolph's 6th wife. To outsiders, they appeared to be a normal married couple living in Las Vegas. But prosecutors would later argue that behind the scenes, Randolph was planning something deadly. According to investigators, he stood to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars from Sharon's life insurance policy. Prosecutors claimed that greed had once again become the driving force behind his actions. On a night in May 2008, emergency responders rushed to the couple's home after reports of a shooting. Inside, they discovered Sharon Corse dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Another man, Michael Miller, was also dead. Randolph told police a dramatic story. He claimed he had returned home, found his wife murdered, encountered a masked intruder, and shot the man in self-defense. For a brief moment, the story sounded believable. But detectives quickly noticed problems. As they dug deeper, investigators concluded that Michael Miller was not a random intruder at all. Instead, prosecutors alleged that Randolph had recruited Miller to murder Sharon as part of a staged home invasion. Once Sharon was dead, Randolph allegedly turned on Miller and killed him as well, eliminating the one person who could expose the plot. The result was a double homicide disguised as self-defense. The case fascinated the nation. Television networks covered every development. True crime documentaries examined his history. Reporters highlighted the extraordinary fact that 4 of his wives had died. The nickname Black Widower spread across headlines and documentaries, turning Randolph into one of America's most infamous suspected serial spouse killers. In 2017, a jury convicted Randolph and sentenced him to death. Yet the story was not over. The Nevada Supreme Court later overturned the conviction, ruling that jurors had heard evidence that should not have been admitted. For many inmates, such a ruling would have meant a second chance. For Randolph, it merely delayed the inevitable. A retrial followed in 2023. Once again, prosecutors laid out their case. Once again, jurors listened to the evidence surrounding Sharon Corse and Michael Miller, and once again, Randolph was found guilty. In 2024, he received a sentence that could keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. By then, he was no longer the confident man who once believed he could outsmart investigators. He had become one of Nevada's most notorious inmates. Unlike some of the men on this list, Thomas Randolph is not known for gang wars, prison violence, or mass shootings. His notoriety comes from something arguably more unsettling: the allegation that he repeatedly turned love into a weapon and used trust as a pathway to profit. Decades after the deaths that made him famous, the name Thomas Randolph remains a symbol of deception, greed, and betrayal on a scale few criminals have ever matched. Number 3. Zackaria Luz. Inside the brutal world of American prison gangs, reputation can be more powerful than any weapon. Some inmates earn respect through fear. Others earn it through violence. And then there are those whose names become symbols of entire criminal organizations. According to prosecutors and prison investigators, Zackaria Luz belonged to that category. For years, Luz was associated with the notorious Aryan Warriors, one of Nevada's most feared prison gangs. While many inmates spend their time behind bars trying to avoid trouble, gang leaders often operate under a completely different set of rules. Power, loyalty, revenge, and control become the currency of survival. In that world, Zackaria Luz built a reputation that eventually made him one of the most recognizable gang-affiliated inmates inside Nevada's prison system. Unlike serial killers whose crimes explode across national headlines, Luz's story developed largely behind prison walls. Details about his early childhood remain limited in public records, but by the time he entered Nevada's correctional system, authorities believed he had become deeply involved in organized criminal activity. Prosecutors later linked him to the Aryan Warriors, a violent prison gang that law enforcement agencies have described as being involved in racketeering, drug trafficking, extortion, assaults, and murders. The Aryan Warriors had long been viewed as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations operating within Nevada prisons. Investigators claimed that gang members maintained strict codes of loyalty and often settled disputes through violence. Membership offered protection, influence, and access to illegal activities, but it also came with deadly consequences. According to court records, Luz eventually became one of the gang members caught in a sweeping racketeering investigation aimed at dismantling the organization's influence. Prosecutors argued that the gang operated like a criminal enterprise, directing illegal activities both inside and outside prison walls. The case attracted significant attention because it exposed the extent to which prison gangs could continue operating even while their members were incarcerated. As the years passed, Luz remained a figure connected to Nevada's prison gang culture. His name appeared in investigations involving organized criminal activity, and authorities viewed him as an inmate whose influence extended beyond his prison cell. While many prisoners spend their sentences trying to stay invisible, Luz became known precisely because he wasn't invisible. Then came the violence that would place Ely State Prison back in national headlines. In July 2024, one of the deadliest prison incidents in Nevada's recent history erupted inside Ely State Prison. What began as a confrontation quickly escalated into a bloodbath. When the violence ended, multiple inmates were dead, and several others were seriously injured. Correctional officers rushed to restore order as investigators attempted to determine exactly what had happened. Among the dead was Zackaria Luz. Authorities later identified him as one of 3 inmates killed during the attack. Reports indicated that the violence involved rival gang members and represented the latest chapter in a long history of prison gang warfare. For investigators, the incident served as another reminder that some of the most dangerous battles in America do not occur on city streets, but inside maximum security prisons. The killings shocked many observers because of the sheer level of violence involved. Ely State Prison was already known as Nevada's most secure correctional facility, housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders. Yet even within those heavily guarded walls, deadly conflicts continued to erupt. Following the incident, prosecutors launched an extensive investigation. Several inmates were later charged in connection with the attack, and authorities described the violence as deliberate rather than spontaneous. The case drew attention from true crime followers across the country, many of whom were fascinated by the secretive world of prison gangs and the deadly rivalries that exist behind bars. For Zackaria Luz, the story ended where so many gang stories ultimately do, with violence. Unlike criminals who die after years of freedom, Luz spent his final days inside one of America's toughest prisons. The same world of gangs, loyalty, and power that had shaped much of his prison life eventually became the setting for his death. Today, his name remains linked to both the Aryan Warriors and the deadly Ely State Prison attack that left multiple inmates dead. To some, he was a powerful gang figure. To others, he was another example of how prison gangs continue to fuel violence long after a criminal has been sentenced. Whatever the perspective, one thing is certain. Zackaria Luz lived in a world where violence was often the language of power, and in the end, it was that same violence that wrote the final chapter of his story. Number 4. Anthony Williams. Some inmates become notorious because of a single horrific crime. Others gain attention because of who they become once they enter prison. Anthony Williams belonged to a category that correctional officers understand all too well, an inmate whose life became deeply intertwined with the violent culture of maximum security incarceration. Long before his name appeared in headlines connected to Ely State Prison, Williams had already accumulated a lengthy criminal record. Public records showed that he was serving a sentence that included murder and habitual criminal convictions, making him one of the many dangerous offenders housed within Nevada's most secure prison system. Unlike criminals who receive national attention through televised trials or media coverage, Williams spent much of his life operating in the shadows of the criminal justice system. Details about his early years remain limited, but court records reveal a pattern familiar to many career offenders. Encounters with law enforcement, escalating criminal behavior, and repeated involvement with the justice system eventually placed him on a path that led to a life behind bars. By the time he arrived at Ely State Prison, he was already considered a serious offender with little chance of ever returning to society. Located in the remote Nevada desert, Ely State Prison is not an ordinary correctional facility. The prison houses some of the state's most violent murderers, gang members, and high-risk offenders. Many inmates spend years navigating an environment where respect, alliances, and survival often determine daily life. For prisoners serving life sentences, prison itself becomes an entire world. Relationships are formed, rivalries develop, gangs compete for influence, every interaction can carry consequences. As years passed, Williams became one of hundreds of inmates serving lengthy sentences inside the facility. To the outside world, he was largely forgotten. Like many prisoners serving life terms, his story rarely attracted media attention. But that would change dramatically in the summer of 2024. On July 30th, 2024, violence erupted inside Ely State Prison. What happened next would become one of the deadliest prison incidents Nevada had witnessed in recent years. According to investigators, a confrontation involving multiple inmates rapidly escalated into a brutal attack. Correctional officers rushed to intervene, but by the time order was restored, several inmates had suffered severe injuries. The prison was immediately placed on lockdown as emergency personnel responded to the scene. Among those killed was Anthony Williams. Authorities later confirmed that Williams died during the violence, along with 2 other inmates. The killings immediately triggered a major investigation involving prison officials, law enforcement agencies, and prosecutors. As details emerged, investigators began examining possible gang involvement and the relationships between the inmates connected to the attack. The incident sent shockwaves through Nevada's correctional system. Even within maximum security prisons, murders of this scale are relatively rare. The fact that multiple inmates died in a single outbreak of violence raised serious concerns about gang rivalries and organized criminal activity behind bars. For investigators, the case revealed just how dangerous prison life can remain, even after offenders have already been removed from society. As the investigation continued, authorities identified several inmates allegedly connected to the attack. Prosecutors described the violence as deliberate and coordinated, rather than a spontaneous fight. Criminal charges followed, and the incident became a major news story throughout Nevada. For Anthony Williams, however, the investigation came too late. His story had already reached its conclusion. Unlike many notorious criminals whose names become famous because of what they did on the outside, Williams became known because of how his life ended inside one of America's toughest prisons. After surviving years within Nevada's correctional system, he ultimately became a victim of the same violent environment that had defined much of his incarceration. The death of Anthony Williams served as another reminder that prison walls do not eliminate violence. In some cases, they simply concentrate it. Inside Ely State Prison, where many inmates have little hope of release, disputes can become deadly, loyalties can shift overnight, and gang rivalries can erupt without warning. The 2024 killings demonstrated that reality in the most brutal way possible. Today, Anthony Williams is remembered less for the crimes that originally sent him to prison, and more for the violent event that ended his life. His death became part of one of the most significant prison investigations in Nevada's recent history, ensuring that his name would forever remain connected to the deadly violence that unfolded within the walls of Ely State Prison. Number 5. Scott Dozier. Among the many dangerous inmates who passed through Ely State Prison, few generated as much national attention as Scott Raymond Dozier. Unlike most death row prisoners who spend years filing appeals and fighting to stay alive, Dozier became famous for doing the exact opposite. He openly demanded his own execution, turning his case into one of the strangest and most controversial stories in modern American criminal justice. Born on March 20, 1970 in California, Dozier's early life gave little indication that he would one day become one of Nevada's most notorious death row inmates. Friends who knew him during his younger years described a man who drifted between jobs and struggled to maintain stability. He spent time working in construction and other trades, but beneath the surface he became increasingly involved in the criminal underworld, particularly the illegal drug trade that flourished throughout parts of the western United States. By the late 1990s, Dozier had immersed himself in methamphetamine trafficking. The drug business promised quick money, but it also brought him into contact with dangerous individuals. As investigators would later discover, greed and mistrust within that world eventually led to deadly consequences. The first murder linked to Dozier involved a man named Jeremiah Miller. In 2002, Miller disappeared under suspicious circumstances. According to prosecutors, A dispute over methamphetamine and money escalated into violence. Authorities later alleged that Dozier murdered Miller and then took extraordinary steps to conceal the crime. Investigators claimed Miller's body was dismembered after the killing, with portions of the remains disposed of in an effort to prevent identification. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned detectives. But the violence did not stop there. A second victim, Jason Green, also became entangled in Dozier's criminal activities. Prosecutors argued that Green knew too much about the earlier murder and therefore became a threat. According to testimony presented in court, Green was lured into a fatal situation and ultimately killed to protect the criminal operation and prevent information from reaching authorities. As investigators pieced together the evidence, a disturbing picture emerged. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. Prosecutors described Dozier as a calculating individual who viewed murder as a practical solution to problems. The investigation eventually led authorities directly to him. Witness statements, physical evidence, and testimony from associates helped prosecutors build a case that would ultimately result in multiple murder convictions. During the trial, jurors heard detailed accounts of the killings and the efforts allegedly made to conceal them. The verdict was devastating. Dozier was convicted and sentenced to death, placing him among Nevada's most dangerous offenders. He was transferred to Ely State Prison, where Nevada's death row is located. For most inmates, that would have been the end of the story. For Scott Dozier, it was only the beginning. While many death row prisoners spend decades fighting their sentences through appeals and legal challenges, Dozier stunned the nation by announcing that he wanted to die. He repeatedly told reporters, attorneys, and courts that he accepted responsibility for his crimes and wished to be executed as soon as possible. His position created an unusual legal battle. Nevada officials attempted to move forward with the execution process, but complications arose involving execution drugs and legal challenges from pharmaceutical companies. The case quickly gained national attention as courts debated whether the state could proceed. Meanwhile, Dozier remained firm. He gave interviews from prison and repeatedly stated that he was tired of waiting. His comments attracted international media coverage, turning him into one of the most talked-about death row inmates in America. As years passed, the delays continued. Executions were postponed, court hearings followed, legal disputes intensified. Yet Dozier's position never changed. The irony was impossible to ignore. A convicted double murderer who wanted to die was being prevented from doing so by the very legal system designed to carry out his sentence. Then, in January 2019, the story took an unexpected turn. Correctional officers discovered Dozier dead inside his cell at Ely State Prison. Authorities ruled the death a suicide. After years of demanding execution, he ultimately died before the state could carry out his sentence. News of his death spread across the country. For some observers, it represented the final chapter in a bizarre legal saga. For others, it highlighted the complexities surrounding capital punishment in the United States. Regardless of perspective, Scott Dozier's case remains one of the most unusual death row stories in modern history. Unlike many notorious killers who spent their final years fighting for survival, Dozier spent his demanding the opposite. He transformed himself from a convicted murderer into the center of a national debate about execution, justice, and the purpose of death row itself. Today, his name remains permanently linked to Ely State Prison, not only because of the brutal murders that sent him there, but because of the extraordinary battle that followed. In a prison filled with dangerous men, Scott Dozier stood apart, a killer who spent years asking for death and became famous because the system refused to give it to him. Number 6. Darren Mack. Some criminals spend years building a reputation in the underworld before committing the crime that destroys their lives. Darren Mack was different. Before his name became associated with murder, manhunts, and one of Nevada's most shocking criminal cases, He was known as a successful businessman, a wealthy entrepreneur, and a respected member of the Reno community. To those who knew him during his earlier years, Mack appeared to have everything. He owned businesses, accumulated wealth, and enjoyed a lifestyle that many people could only dream about. From the outside, his life seemed like a success story. But behind closed doors, his marriage was falling apart, and the collapse of that relationship would eventually trigger a chain of events that stunned the entire nation. Born in the early 1960s, Darren Mack built his fortune through the pawn shop business. Over time, he became one of Reno's most recognizable businessmen. Friends and associates described him as intelligent, ambitious, and highly competitive. Yet, as his marriage deteriorated, those closest to him began noticing signs of growing anger and frustration. The divorce between Darren Mack and his wife, Charla Mack, became increasingly bitter. Court records later revealed ongoing disputes involving finances, property, and child custody. What should have been handled inside a courtroom gradually evolved into a personal war. Family court proceedings became emotionally charged, and tensions between the couple continued to escalate. Then came the morning of June 12, 2006. Inside the family home in Reno, Nevada, Charla Mack was preparing to begin her day. What happened next would shock the state. Authorities later determined that Darren Mack attacked and killed his wife inside the residence. Investigators found evidence indicating she had been stabbed multiple times. The brutal nature of the attack horrified both law enforcement and the public. A contentious divorce had suddenly become a murder investigation. But the violence was not over. Only hours after Charla's death, another attack occurred, this time involving the judge overseeing the Mack divorce proceedings. As Judge Chuck Weller arrived at his office, a gunman opened fire. Multiple shots struck the judge, causing severe injuries. Remarkably, he survived. Investigators immediately connected the shooting to the murder of Charla Mack. According to prosecutors, Darren Mack blamed Judge Weller for rulings made during the divorce and had decided to eliminate him as well. The state of Nevada suddenly found itself dealing with a case unlike anything it had seen in years. A wealthy businessman had allegedly murdered his wife and attempted to assassinate a sitting judge on the very same day. The attacks triggered a massive manhunt. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began searching for Mack, who had disappeared after the crimes. His face appeared on news broadcasts throughout the country. Helicopters joined the search. Federal authorities became involved. For days, nobody knew where he was. As investigators pieced together his movements, they discovered he had fled Nevada and was attempting to avoid capture. The search eventually stretched into the wilderness of Arizona, where authorities believed he was hiding. The manhunt ended near the small town of Williams, Arizona. Facing overwhelming pressure and realizing escape was becoming impossible, Darren Mack surrendered to authorities without further violence. The arrest brought an end to one of the most dramatic fugitive hunts Nevada had experienced in years. Yet the legal battle was only beginning. Prosecutors prepared a case that included murder charges and attempted murder charges. Evidence presented during the proceedings painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and resentment. The prosecution argued that the attacks were carefully planned acts of revenge rather than spontaneous outbursts. Confronted with the evidence against him, Mack eventually entered guilty pleas. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Charla Mack, along with additional decades for the attempted murder of Judge Weller. The sentence guaranteed that he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. For many people, the most disturbing aspect of the case was not simply the violence itself. It was how quickly a seemingly successful life had collapsed. Darren Mack was not a gang leader, a career criminal, or a notorious serial killer. He was a wealthy businessman who allowed anger and obsession to dictate his actions. Inside Nevada's prison system, he became another inmate serving a life sentence, far removed from the business empire he had once controlled. Years later, the case remains one of the most infamous crimes in Nevada history. The murder of Darren Mack and the attempted assassination of Judge Chuck Weller continue to be studied as an example of how domestic disputes can escalate into catastrophic violence. Today, Darren Mack's name remains permanently linked to a tragedy that destroyed multiple lives and shocked an entire state. What began as a bitter divorce ended with murder, a nationwide manhunt, and a life sentence that ensured he would never experience freedom again. Number 7. Zane Floyd. Some criminals become infamous because of years of violence, others because of a single act so horrifying that it permanently scars an entire community. For Zane Michael Floyd, that act occurred on a spring afternoon in Las Vegas and transformed him from an ordinary citizen into one of the most notorious death row inmates in Nevada history. Born on May 20, 1976, Floyd spent much of his early life moving between different communities. Friends and acquaintances who knew him during his younger years often described him as quiet and reserved. Unlike many violent offenders, he did not grow up with a public reputation for criminal behavior. There were no notorious gang affiliations, no lengthy criminal record attracting headlines, and no indication that he would one day commit one of the deadliest mass shootings in Nevada history. Before the crime that made him infamous, Floyd served in the United States military. However, his military career was troubled, and reports later revealed disciplinary issues during his service. After leaving the military, he struggled to establish stability in civilian life. Employment problems, personal frustrations, and growing emotional difficulties appeared to shape the years leading up to the attack. Then came June 3, 1999. On that day, Las Vegas was preparing for what should have been an ordinary summer afternoon. Customers entered a neighborhood grocery store, employees stocked shelves, and families went about their daily routines. No one inside the store could have imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold. Armed with a shotgun, Floyd entered a grocery store in northwest Las Vegas. Within moments, chaos erupted. Witnesses later described scenes of terror as customers and employees scrambled for cover. The gunman moved through the store, firing at victims with little warning. Panic spread as people attempted to escape the violence unfolding around them. When the shooting ended, 4 people had lost their lives. The victims included store employees who had simply reported to work that day expecting nothing more than a normal shift. Families would later receive devastating phone calls informing them that their loved ones were never coming home. Another victim survived despite suffering serious injuries. The attack immediately became one of the most shocking crimes in Las Vegas history. Police officers quickly responded to the scene and launched an intensive investigation. Unlike many major criminal cases, authorities did not spend months searching for a suspect. Evidence rapidly pointed toward Floyd, and investigators soon pieced together the events that led to the massacre. During interviews and court proceedings, prosecutors painted a disturbing picture of a man consumed by anger and resentment. Evidence suggested that Floyd specifically targeted the grocery store because he blamed management for workplace grievances and personal frustrations. What made the case particularly chilling was the apparent lack of concern for innocent lives. Customers shopping for groceries suddenly found themselves caught in a deadly attack that had nothing to do with them. The randomness of the violence amplified public fear and generated national media coverage. As the case moved to trial, prosecutors sought the harshest punishment available under Nevada law. Jurors listened to witness testimony, reviewed evidence, and heard emotional statements from victims' families. The stories were heartbreaking. Parents described children who would never return home. Friends spoke about loved ones whose lives ended without warning. Survivors recounted the terror of hearing gunshots echo through the store as they desperately searched for safety. After deliberation, the jury found Floyd guilty. The sentence was death. The ruling placed him among Nevada's most notorious death row inmates and ensured his transfer into the state's highest security prison system, including Ely State Prison, where many of Nevada's most dangerous offenders have been housed. For years, Floyd remained on death row. Unlike Scott Dozier, who repeatedly demanded execution, Floyd pursued the legal appeals commonly associated with capital punishment cases. Court proceedings continued as attorneys challenged various aspects of his conviction and sentence. Meanwhile, the memory of the attack never faded from the minds of those affected. The grocery store shooting became one of the defining criminal cases in Las Vegas history. For many residents, it represented a tragic reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be shattered by an act of extreme violence. As the years passed, Floyd's name became permanently linked to the massacre. New generations learned about the case through documentaries, news retrospectives, and true crime investigations. The victims' families continued carrying the emotional scars left behind by the attack. Unlike some inmates on this list who gained notoriety through gang activity, organized crime, or multiple murders spread across several years, Floyd's infamy stems from a single day, a few terrifying minutes that changed countless lives forever. Today, Zane Floyd remains one of the most infamous inmates ever associated with Nevada's prison system. His case stands as one of the darkest chapters in the state's criminal history and serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences that can result when anger, resentment, and violence collide. For the families of the victims, the passage of time has never erased the loss. And for Nevada, the name Zane Floyd remains forever connected to one of the deadliest mass shootings the state had ever witnessed. Behind the walls of Ely State Prison, Nevada has housed some of the most feared criminals in modern American history. From ruthless robbery mastermind Jose Vigoa to the manipulative Thomas Randolph. From gang figures like Zackaria Luz to killers such as Scott Dozier, Darren Mack, Anthony Williams, and Zane Floyd, each left behind a trail of violence, tragedy, and shattered lives. Some died behind bars. Others remain incarcerated. But all of them earned a place among the most dangerous inmates ever confined within Nevada's most notorious maximum security prison. And while their stories may differ, they share one chilling truth. Once the gates of Ely State Prison closed behind them, freedom was no longer part of their future.